At 9,400 feet above sea level, a diesel engine is already fighting a war it didn't start. The air up there is not the air you know at the bottom of a valley. It is thinner, colder at the molecular level, carrying roughly 30% less oxygen per cubic foot than the sea-level atmosphere a turbocharged engine was designed to breathe. A fuel injection system calibrated at low elevation does not know this. It keeps delivering the same volume of fuel it always has into combustion chambers that now have 30% less oxygen to burn it with. The result is a rich condition: unburned fuel fouling injectors, choking exhaust stacks, robbing the engine of the clean combustion it needs to make torque. The engine is not broken. It is simply breathing air it was never asked to understand. What happened on a Saturday in late July of 2019 on the pull strip behind the Gunnison County Fairgrounds in Gunnison, Colorado, at an elevation of 9,400 feet, was what happens when one person understood that number and everyone else did not. Her name is Dara Mosset. She is 47 years old, and she has been running freight through the central Colorado Rockies for 22 years in a 1974 Peterbilt 359 with a Cummins KT, a 600 engine. She rebuilt herself over the course of 14 months in a rented bay in Montrose, using a dial indicator, a set of torque wrenches she bought used, a factory service manual she found at an estate sale, and a specific understanding of what thin air does to diesel combustion that she arrived at not through a degree program or a sponsored testing budget, but through 12 years of running the same roads at the same elevations and writing down what she observed. The air was 51 degrees at 8 in the morning when she backed the Peterbilt into position. The sky was the particular shade of deep blue that only exists above 8,000 feet, the kind of blue that looks painted on. The grass along the fence line was still holding dew. The exhaust from the staging rigs hung low and flat in the cool air, not rising the way it does at lower elevations, drifting instead across the strip in slow horizontal sheets. The smell of it was the smell of every pull she had ever attended: fuel oil and hot metal, and the faint sweetness of hydraulic fluid baking off brake drums. But thinner here, the way everything is thinner here, cut with the pine and granite smell of the mountains that surrounded the valley on every side. There were 430 people in the grandstands and along the fence line that morning. Most of them had been there before. Gunnison is not a large town, roughly 5,000 people, situated in a high-altitude ranching valley at the confluence of the Gunnison River and Tamichi Creek, surrounded by mountains that top out above 14,000 feet and make the valley floor feel, in late July, like the only flat place in the world. The pull had been running for 11 years. The crowd knew what they were watching. They knew the difference between a rig that was built for the mountains and a rig that was built for sea level and trucked up in a custom trailer. The rig that had come up from Texas was a 2018 Kenworth T68, with a Packer MX-13 engine, making a claimed 750 horsepower at the flywheel, running on a modified injection map that a performance shop in Lubbock had tuned on a chassis dyno at approximately 3,200 feet above sea level. The trailer it arrived on was a 40-foot enclosed aluminum unit with the shop's name and logo across the side in 6-inch letters. The crew was 4 people. The driver was a man named Cole Rayfield, who had placed in the top 3 at 7 regional pulling events in 2018 and 2019, all of them at elevations between 500 and 3,800 feet. He was 38 years old, and he wore a jacket with his sponsor's name on the chest and he walked the strip twice before the event started, measuring the clay with his boot heel the way you do when you're confident and want everyone to see that you are confident. Dara Mosset watched him do this from the cab of her Peterbilt, drinking coffee from a thermos she had filled at the motel on the north end of town at 6:30 that morning. She did not walk the strip. She had walked it the night before alone when the fairgrounds were quiet and the only light was the sodium vapor lamp at the far end of the staging area. She had pressed her boot into the clay at 4 different points and noted the moisture content, the compaction, the way the surface would behave under load. She had done this at every pull she had entered for 11 years. She did not need to do it again in daylight with an audience. Now I need to stop here and explain something, because without it, the rest of what happened on that strip does not make sense. And this is the intellectual key to everything. A turbocharged diesel engine, the kind that moves freight through mountain passes and pulls sleds down competition strips, makes its power through combustion. Fuel and air mix in the cylinder, compress, ignite, and the expanding gases push the piston down. The turbocharger is there to force more air into the cylinder than atmospheric pressure alone would deliver, which allows more fuel to be burned per cycle, which makes more power. The system is elegant, and it is ruthless. The engine will only make as much power as the air it is breathing will support. More oxygen, more power. Less oxygen, less power. At sea level, the air contains roughly 0.075 pounds of air per cubic foot. At 9,400 feet, that number drops to approximately 0.052 pounds per cubic foot. That is a 30% reduction in oxygen density. A turbocharger helps. It compresses the intake air, partially compensating for the thin atmosphere. But a turbocharger tuned for sea level does not compress enough to fully recover what the altitude has taken. The engine is still running lean on oxygen, and if the fuel delivery is not adjusted downward to match, rich on fuel. Unburned fuel in the combustion chamber is not power. It is fouling. It is black smoke and lost torque, and, at the wrong moment on the wrong pull, it is a truck that stops moving at 140 feet. Here is what Dara Mosset understood that the Lubbock shop did not. The KTA 600 in her Peterbilt, the Cummins K-Series engine, 6 cylinders in a V configuration, a big block diesel that Cummins introduced in 1966 and refined through the 1970s and into the 1980s, was not tuned for sea level. It was not tuned for 3,200 feet. It had been rebuilt by her hands over 14 months, with an intentional altitude margin built into every component that touched combustion. The injector sizing was reduced from the factory specification for sea level operation. The fuel delivery curves were mapped to the oxygen density at 8,500 to 10,500 feet. The elevation band she ran in, the elevation band she competed in, the elevation band she had spent 12 years learning from the inside. The turbocharger boost pressure was set conservatively, not for peak sea level output, but for the best achievable combustion efficiency in thin air. The intercooler was rebuilt with a larger core to compensate for the reduced cooling effect of lower density air. The timing was advanced slightly from factory specification, because thin air requires a longer flame front travel to achieve complete combustion. She had not done this in one afternoon. She had done it the way you do something when you have no one to call and no budget for mistakes. Slowly, methodically, testing across seasons and elevations, making notes in a spiral notebook she kept in the door pocket of the Peterbilt, adjusting, running again, adjusting again. The notebook had 47 pages of entries. The first entry was dated March of 2007. The last was dated the Wednesday before the Gunnison pull. Let me tell you something about the KTA 600 that matters for what happened next. This engine, in its stock configuration, does not make its peak torque at high RPM. It makes it low, deep in the power band, in the 1,200 to 1,400 RPM range, where the combustion event has time to fully develop and the piston is receiving force across the longest portion of its stroke. At sea level, the factory-rated KTA 600 produces approximately 1,850 foot-pounds of torque at 1,200 revolutions per minute. That number, in Dara Mosset's rebuilt and altitude-tuned version, was lower in absolute terms. She estimated, based on her own measurements, approximately 1,600 foot-pounds at the same RPM in the Gunnison altitude. But it was clean torque, fully combusted, not choked by excess fuel or starved by oxygen deficit. It was the torque of an engine that understood where it was. The Kenworth's MX-13, with its 750 claimed horsepower, makes its peak power at significantly higher RPM. In sea-level conditions, it is a formidable engine. At 9,400 feet, with an injection map calibrated for a different atmosphere, it is an engine that does not know what is happening to it. Think about that for a moment. Not as an engineering abstraction, as a physical fact that was about to play out in front of 430 people on a strip of compacted clay in a mountain valley in Colorado. The morning moved the way mornings move at high-altitude events. Slowly at first, the early pulls running through the lighter classes, the crowd settling into their coffee and their conversation, the temperature climbing from 51 degrees toward the low 60s as the sun cleared the ridge to the east and found the valley floor. By 10:30, the open class was staging, and the crowd had tightened along the fence line, the way crowds do when they sense something is about to be worth watching. Cole Rayfield pulled the Kenworth to the line at 11:14. The crew chief, a broad man in a matching jacket, early 40s, who had spent the morning standing near the trailer with his arms crossed and the expression of someone who had already calculated the outcome, walked the hookup himself, checked the chain, stepped back, and gave a single nod. The Kenworth's exhaust stacks pulsed with the engine at idle. The sound was impressive. At sea level, it would have been the sound of significant power waiting to be released. The sled engaged. Rayfield brought the RPM up. The Kenworth moved from the line with authority, the tires compressing into the clay with the confidence of a well-funded machine. The crowd responded, a collective lean forward, a murmur of appreciation. At 50 feet, the truck was moving well. At 100 feet, the exhaust stacks had darkened. At 120 feet, the smoke was black and heavy. The kind of smoke that means unburned fuel. The kind of smoke that means the combustion event is not completing. The kind of smoke that means the engine is fighting an atmosphere it was not built for. At 140 feet, the Kenworth stopped. Not gradually. Not with a long, slow deceleration that might have suggested the sled weight had simply exceeded capacity. It stopped with the abruptness of an engine that has lost its combustion, that is pushing fuel through cylinders that cannot burn it cleanly, that has encountered the 30% oxygen deficit at the worst possible moment. Under maximum load, at the RPM where the injection map was delivering sea-level fuel quantities into mountain air. The crowd was quiet for a moment. Then it was not. The crew chief walked to the truck without changing his expression. He put his hand on the door handle and said something to Rayfield that no one standing outside could hear. The Kenworth was pulled off the strip. The crew chief stood at the edge of the staging area with his arms crossed again, and he looked at the distance marker at 140 feet. And then he looked at Dara Mosset's Peterbilt, which was idling in the staging lane with a sound that was not impressive and was not meant to be. The 1974 Peterbilt 359 is not a beautiful truck in the way that a restored show truck is beautiful. It is beautiful the way a well-used hand tool is beautiful, through function and age and the particular dignity of something that has been maintained with care rather than with money. The cab is the original cab, repainted once in 1998, in a flat dark green that has since faded to the color of a pine tree in shadow. The hood is long. The 359 has one of the longest hoods in production truck history, a consequence of the BBC cab-behind engine configuration that gives the engine bay enough room to work in. And it carries the patina of 12 years of mountain roads, stone chips along the lower edge, a repaired crease above the passenger side headlight, the kind of surface that tells you this truck has been places. The chrome stacks are original. The fuel tanks are original. The fifth wheel is not original. It was replaced in 2014 with a unit she pulled from a wrecked 1979 Pete that a salvage yard in Delta was parting out, and she machined the mounting surface herself to ensure the fit was correct. She had paid $4,200 for the truck in 2001 from a retired owner-operator in Montrose who had parked it when his health would no longer allow him to drive. The engine had been tired. The transmission, an Eaton Fuller 13-speed, had been functional but worn. She had rebuilt both, the transmission first, the engine 14 years later, when the cylinder liners had worn to the edge of tolerance and she decided that if she was going to pull the engine anyway, she was going to do it right. She climbed down from the cab at 11:42 and walked to the front of the truck and put her hand flat on the hood, just above the grill. It was a habit she had developed years ago and had never examined. Not superstition, not ceremony, just the gesture of someone checking in with something they know well. The hood was warm from the engine heat radiating up through the firewall. She could feel the idle through her palm, the deep, slow pulse of the KTA 600 at 650 RPM, steady and unhurried. A man sitting in the fourth row of the grandstands watched her do this. He was in his early 70s, wearing a canvas work jacket and holding a thermos of coffee in both hands. He had driven 90 minutes from Salida that morning, which is what he did every year when the Gunnison Pull was on the schedule. He had been driving trucks for 31 years before his knees made it impractical, and he had run the same mountain corridors Dara Mosset ran, in the same era of trucks, and he knew the sound of a KTA 600 at idle, the way you know a voice you grew up hearing. When she put her hand on the hood, he set his thermos on the bleacher beside him and leaned forward slightly. Not because he needed a better view, but because he recognized what he was watching and wanted to be present for it. The hookup took 4 minutes. The chain went tight with the short metallic report that it always makes. Not a sound you feel in your chest the way the big engines feel, but a sound you feel in the back of your teeth, sharp and definitive, the sound of slack becoming force. The sled operator gave the signal. The crowd along the fence line had grown. The crew chief was still standing at the edge of the staging area, still watching, his expression now carrying something that was not quite uncertainty but was adjacent to it. Dara Mosset did not bring the RPM up dramatically. She brought it to 1,100 and held it there, and the Peterbilt moved from the line the way a loaded freight truck moves when it has found its gear and its driver. Without announcement, without performance, with the steady, deliberate authority of something that is not trying to impress anyone. The exhaust stacks produced a thin gray plume, clean combustion, the engine burning what it was given with the efficiency of a system that knew exactly how much oxygen was available and had been calibrated to use all of it. At 50 feet, the crowd was quiet. Not the quiet of disinterest, the quiet of attention. The Peterbilt was moving at a walking pace, the tires pressing into the clay without spinning. The long hood tracking straight, the sled dragging behind with the progressive resistance that is the nature of competition pulling sleds, the weight transferring forward with each foot of travel, making the load heavier with every yard the truck covered. At 100 feet, the exhaust had not darkened. The engine note had deepened. The RPM had dropped slightly under load from 1,100 to approximately 950, and the KTA 600 was now operating in the heart of its torque curve at the bottom of the band where the combustion event was fully developed and the piston was receiving force across the maximum arc of its stroke. The turbocharger was spinning in the range it had been rebuilt for. The intercooler was doing its work. The altitude that had killed the Kenworth's combustion was not killing this engine, because this engine had been built for this altitude, had been rebuilt for this altitude, had been driven through these mountains at this altitude 3 times a year for 12 years, by the person who was now holding it at 950 revolutions per minute, under a load that was increasing with every foot of travel. At 140 feet, the crowd understood what they were watching. The distance marker at 140 feet was where the Kenworth had stopped. The Peterbilt crossed it without any change in character. The same engine note, the same thin gray exhaust, the same walking pace, the tires pressing into the clay with the same patient, deliberate force. There was no surge of speed, no dramatic change in sound, no visible effort. The truck simply continued past the point where the other truck had stopped, the way a draft horse continues past the point where a younger animal has given out, not because it is stronger in any absolute sense, but because it was built for the work and the other one was not. The crowd noise started at 140 feet and built from there. At 175 feet, the engine note had dropped to approximately 850 revolutions per minute, and the exhaust stacks were producing a slightly darker plume. Not black, not the foul and smoke of rich combustion, but the deep gray of an engine working at the edge of its calibrated range, burning every molecule of oxygen available to it in the thin mountain air. The frame of the Peterbilt was flexing slightly under the load, the way old frames flex, not with the creak of failure, but with the give of something that has been doing this long enough to know how. The tires had pressed into the clay until the tread was nearly flush with the surface, the weight of the sled distributed across the full contact patch, the clay curling up at the edges like furrows behind a plow blade. At 200 feet, a woman standing at the fence line put both hands over her mouth. At 225 feet, the man in the 4th row picked up his thermos, looked at it, set it back down, and said nothing to anyone. He did not stand. He did not need to stand. At 250 feet, the RPM had dropped to approximately 780, and the KTA 600 was now operating below its rated torque peak, in the range where most engines begin to lose their combustion stability, where the fuel delivery and the air supply and the timing are all fighting to maintain a combustion event that is increasingly difficult to sustain. In a sea-level engine, this is where you would hear the engine beginning to labor, the exhaust darkening, the power falling away. In this engine, in this altitude, at this moment, the combustion remained clean. Because the injection map was not a sea-level map. Because the timing was not a sea-level timing. Because the person who had rebuilt this engine had spent 12 years learning what the mountain air demanded and had given it exactly that. At 281 feet, the truck stopped, not from fouling, not from lost combustion. The sled had reached the end of its travel, the weight fully transferred to the front, the resistance at maximum, and the engine had simply reached the limit of what the available traction and the sled geometry would allow. The truck stopped the way a strong thing stops when it has reached the boundary of the work, completely, without drama, with the settled finality of a job finished. The crowd noise was not a roar in the way that stadium crowds roar. It was a high-altitude crowd noise, 430 people in a mountain valley, the sound carrying differently in thin air, spreading outward and upward rather than building on itself the way it does in enclosed spaces. But it was unambiguous. It was the sound of 430 people who had just watched something they had not expected to watch and would not forget. Dara Mosset set the parking brake and climbed down from the cab. She walked to the rear of the truck and checked the chain connection at the hitch. She walked to the driver's side front tire and crouched down and pressed her thumb into the tread to check the temperature in the compound. She stood up and walked back to the cab and took her thermos from the cup holder and drank from it. She did not raise her hands. She did not turn to the crowd. She did not perform anything. The crew chief walked across the strip toward her. He was a deliberate man, and he walked deliberately. And when he reached her, he stopped and looked at the distance marker at 281 feet, and then he looked at the Peterbilt. He was quiet for a moment. "What are you running in there?" he said. It was not quite a question. "KTA 600, she said. K-Series Cummins." He nodded once, slowly, the nod of someone filing information rather than responding to it. He looked at the truck again. The faded green cab, the long hood, the chrome stacks, the clay pressed into the tread of the rear tires. Then he looked at her. "It's tuned for up here," he said. "It's tuned for up here," she said. He nodded again and walked back to his trailer. He did not say anything further to his crew that anyone standing nearby could hear. He stood at the trailer door with his hand on the latch for a moment before he opened it, looking back at the strip once, at the distance markers, at the two numbers that were now permanent facts, 140 feet and 281 feet, and then he went inside. The man in the fourth row of the grandstand sat for a while after the event concluded, finishing his coffee, watching the strip crew drag the clay back into shape for the next class. He had no connection to Dara Mosset. He did not know her name until he asked the man sitting next to him. He had simply driven 90 minutes from Salida because the Gunnison pull was on the schedule, and he was the kind of person who goes to things like this, who understands what he is looking at when he looks at it, and who finds in the watching of it something that the rest of his week does not provide. He left before the awards were presented. He did not need the awards to tell him what had happened. Dara Mosset still runs the same corridor, US 50 through the Black Canyon, 550 north through Montrose and Ridgeway, the long grade up to Red Mountain Pass at 11,200 feet, down into Ouray, back south through Silverton and Durango. She runs it in the same Peterbilt, which now has over 1.5 million miles on the chassis and a rebuilt engine with a second set of cylinder liners installed by her hands in the same rented bay in Montrose in the winter of 2022. The spiral notebook in the door pocket is the second one. The first one, 47 pages, is in the drawer of the workbench in the bay she rents, under a set of injector sleeves she pulled from the first rebuild and kept because she does not discard things that taught her something. She has entered the Gunnison Pull 3 times since 2019. She has not fouled once. The mountain does not care what something cost, or where it was tuned, or whose name is on the jacket of the person driving it. The mountain has a fixed and non-negotiable oxygen content at 9,400 feet, and it applies that content to every engine that attempts to make power in its air with perfect impartiality. The engines that were built for it find their footing and hold. The engines that were not built for it find the limit of their calibration and stop. This is not a metaphor. It is a physical law. But it is also, if you have been paying attention, something more than that. If you have ever watched someone walk to a piece of equipment they built themselves and put their hand on it, the way Dara Mosset put her hand on that hood, not for luck, not for ceremony, but because they know it that well, drop a comment below and tell me about it. I read every one of them, and I read them carefully, because the people who leave those comments are the people this channel exists for. Every week on this channel, there's another story about someone who did the quiet work, who spent the years, wrote the notebook, rebuilt the engine in a rented bay without a sponsor or an audience, and then drove it to a place where the air was thin and the stakes were real and the ground told the truth. If that is the kind of story you come here for, subscribe, because there are more of them, and they deserve to be told. And if this one landed for you the way it lands for me every time I go back through the footage and the notes, if it hits something that you think someone else needs to hear, pass it on. Stories like this one do not survive on their own. They survive because somebody decides they are worth keeping. The KTA 600 is still running. The notebook is still in the drawer. The mountain is still at 9,400 feet. Nothing needed to change.